Hi, everyone. So I'm Stan, I work at Stripe. Maybe some of you don't know what Stripe is. So Stripe is a payments processor. It was started on Hacker News like 6 to 7 years ago. We specialize in two things: onboarding really easily as a user. You can put all your info in, and right away you can use our API to start processing payments. And we also specialize in marketplaces, so we power the likes of Lyft or Shopify or all of those kind of players. And I personally started using Stripe something like 5 years ago as the first non-US user of Stripe, and got to know them a little bit, and then eventually joined them a year after or 2 years after, about 4 years ago or 3 years ago. And when I joined them, there were 180 people in SF, and I wanted to try to share with you today the, sorry, let's try to reconnect. Share with you today the kind of learnings that I had while working at Stripe and as an IC. So an IC is an individual contributor. So I never made it to management, never wanted to do it, and so it's really kind of an engineer perspective on things. And sorry for the hiccup. Let's try it again. Maybe not, maybe. Cool. All right, so when I joined in early 2015, we were among the 180 people at Stripe. We were about 80 engineers. We had no engineering manager and no product manager. And at that time, Stripe was already processing in something like 10 countries. And so when I started there, before I started actually, I realized during my interviews that they were kind of organized in a very weird way for so many people. And I tried to grab coffees with a couple of people that interviewed me and asked them, well, how do you guys do to organize yourself? How do you pick what task to work on as an engineer? And nobody kind of gave me a satisfying answers. They were all saying, we don't know, with Stripe, it kind of works and it's cool doing business. And it's only after maybe a year working at Stripe that I started building an understanding of what was making Stripe function at that scale with no manager. And I think it relies on three things that were true at Stripe and that are pretty interesting and that I wanted to share with you. The first thing is that it was really shocking when you joined Stripe how much trust there was between engineers, which means that as we were chatting on a project as you were chatting on a project as an engineer with somebody else, you would kind of decide to do this and that, and engineer A would say I'll do X, and engineer B would say I do Y, and really none of X, A or B would really question that the other engineer would do a good job. Everybody would think really that the other engineer would do their best, and things we had a really strong trust between each others. They would do an awesome job. And I think that this kind of very strong trust value created at the time and still creates today to some extent a local separation force, meaning that if I'm collaborating with another engineer next to me, we kind of decide to share some task, and I'm never going to look over their shoulder, and they're never going to look over my shoulder, and we kind of create a local separation force in terms of organization. The other thing that was quite surprising when I joined Stripe from France was the communication policy that they had internally. And we were pretty vocal about it in those years, 2015, a little less so these days for many reasons. But we really had an open communication system that was based on mailing lists. And so basically each team would have a set of mailing lists associated with them, generally what we called a notes list and an archive list. The notes list would be kind of all the notes about meetings that are within the team or external to the team that are important to the team. So it's a mailing list with pretty low volume, but mostly important content about the team. And the archive list is kind of a place where you CC whatever email you send that is even remotely related with the team. So if I'm working on a project that is remotely connected with another team, I would like CC that team/archive. And the interesting thing is that then you have kind of that repository of communication over email. We were also using Slack, but we're pretty big on emails. They serve kind of two different purposes. But we have that kind of repository of content and communication over email that was accessible. And most engineers would actually subscribe to a set of lists that are not necessarily their own team lists. Meaning that if I'm working on card processing, I'll subscribe to Carb Archive and Carb Notes, but I might as well subscribe to Payouts Archive. So Payouts is really the process of paying out the money to the merchant. And just because it's kind of close to my team and I'm interested in learning more about what they're doing. And so the property that it created, bear with me, is that for any pair of emails sent by two engineers, there existed an engineer that would see those two emails. It doesn't mean that an engineer would read all the emails. It just means that for any pair of email, an engineer would exist that read the two, which means that the kind of a lists coverage of engineers is kind of a superset of the actual emails that are sent. And so it was kind of a common custom for that engineer that would read those two emails, if they were kind of diverging a little bit, to actually ping those two engineers and say, hey, by the way, you're doing this, he's doing that, it seems that you're doing the same thing or something quite different, or the same thing in a different way, or something that is not really kind of well aligned. And those two guys would kind of get together and resolve that difference. And so what that created is really a long-range attraction force within the organization. So we covered the local separation and long-range attraction. And finally, one thing that was really true at Stripe, and I think it's maybe all of the three properties that I'm giving you right now, it's probably the wickiest, the more bullshitty, but that's fine, is that Stripe is I mean, I don't know how much you know about payments, but payments are kind of complicated under the hood, but very simple in conceptually. You just need to move money. And I think for Stripe, it's really true as well as a company that we had a clear vision of where we wanted to go. We had built, like a couple of years before, a pretty nice API that was enjoyed by developers. That API used to work at the very beginning in the US for cards, only in dollar. And as we grew Stripe, we knew that we would need to kind of color the box of all of the countries, all of the payment methods, all of the payout methods that API could cover. It means like building a ton of complexity under the hood to deliver a product that has more coverage but stays simple. And so I think that these created kind of a really clear relation of engineers to what the product is and where the company should go at that time. And that kind of created an alignment of engineers. It means that everybody kind of know where we're going without too much efforts being put in that. I think it's probably true of many startups anyway. Maybe if you think about Facebook, at the very beginning, Facebook, we're connecting people, and then Facebook in the middle, like, we have a wall, but we have a chat, but we have a wall. I mean, where are we going? Might be a little bit more complicated. In that case, it's easy, we're processing payments. And so those three properties, local separation, long-range attraction, and alignment, are actually the three exact properties that you need to simulate flocking behavior in computers. So you've probably all already seen those kind of simulation of a flock of birds or flocks of fish that kind of self-organize around obstacles and go from a place A to a place B. And so my theory about how it was actually working without any product manager or manager was that we were actually running a flocking simulation at human scale for those years. We were just a bunch of fish writing code in a self-organized way, which was interesting. And what is interesting to see as well is that as we scale, so today we are about 1,000 people, and I think, and I'm focusing on the engineering team here, the first property that really broke is the long-range attraction, meaning that as we scale, as the team grew, as the volume of emails grew, as the number of interaction grew, it was no longer true that for any pair of email would exist an engineer that would route the two emails. And so if you do a flocking simulation, if you break any of those characteristics, even slightly, you'll see that your flock just explodes and go over a place. And so that's when you actually need, and that's when we actually needed as a company to add engineering managers and product manager to help continue to organize the blob of engineers that were building Stripe. And so that's kind of and I'm happy to dive into any of those things that we've seen at Stripe over the years. That's kind of generally the tools that you use to build an engineering organization. You kind of set up a ladder to help people know where they are. You start to organize your hiring in a much more industrial way. You hire managers. You start planning. You start to have visibility into what you're going to be doing in 3 months. That's awesome. And finally, you do a ton of reorgs, growing from 180 people to 1,000, which might seem really small compared to companies like Facebook and Google. It's already a pretty complex process and involves like reorganizing ourselves quite often. And so you have to learn how to do that efficiently. And so pivoting on that note about engineering organization, one thing that came up as well as while thinking about all the things we've done at Stripe and how we organize ourselves to grow to that size is the following thought that I find quite interesting. So if we consider an engineering organization, there is necessarily a maximum useful engineering output that organization will provide. As you add people, the amount of work that those set of people will be able to do is hopefully growing. But I think that it's also true that you have diminishing returns in terms of useful output of an organization, of an engineering organization, meaning that as you had people, because we're human and we're imperfect and we are political and we don't have we are inefficient in many ways. As you add more people, you actually diminish the usefulness of the last guy that you add. That's kind of not great, but that's how it is. That kind of creates a convex curve, if I'm not wrong, that goes through zero. You start alone, or nobody is doing anything in the vacuum. You're on your own, and adding yourself gives you a lot of outputs because it's awesome. You're starting a company, and as you add more people, the incremental higher usefulness from an engineering perspective diminishes. And then there's also minimum useful engineering output that is necessary to sustain your growth. So let me unpack this one. Basically, as you grow as a team, you start creating, or as an organization, or as a company, you start creating interfaces with the external world. You start having contracts or obligations, or products that are actually working, or infrastructures that are actually running. And as you build those things, the amount of work required to maintain them is actually growing, meaning that it's pretty obvious if you have a high growth startup that sees an exponential usage curve, if only from in terms of number of servers that you'll probably need to add more servers, build a larger infrastructure, and the amount of work that you'll have to put in there is growing. If you are Stripe as an example, as you grow and have more and more elaborated users that are joining, they have more and more asks that are more and more elaborated themselves. And only to sustain the growth of your business, even if you don't sign a new user, you'll still have a ton of work to do just to catch up with your user needs. And so there is a curve that is kind of the minimal necessary outputs required by an engineering organization to sustain the growth of the organization itself or the company. And that curve starts in zero, obviously, because at the beginning there's nothing, nobody working on nothing, and it eventually takes a concave, convex, whatever, shape. And so what it means is that if you have two curves, one convex, one concave, that both goes through 0, 0, they necessarily cross somewhere in the plan. And what that means is that as you grow your company, you will navigate in that space, meaning that you're going to hire people, they'll bring you more resources. At the same time, your company will grow. They require more resources to just live. And you'll necessarily go up and right all the way to a place where you might end up in what I called an innovation coffin corner. An innovation coffin corner, the reference is to the coffin corner in aviation, where you've got the Mach limit, which is the speed at which a conventional aircraft can go, above which it kind of goes supersonic and cannot fly anymore and just falls, unless it's a supersonic plane, sorry. And you have the stall limit, which is the speed, the minimum speed at which you have to go if you want your plane to fly it. And the stall limit is vertical; it's constant with altitude, and the Mach limit is as that shape. And so basically, you can end up in a coffin corner, which is a place where if you go faster, you die, and if you go slower, you die. And so it's very hard to lose altitude to open up the space again while staying alive. And so that's why it's called coffin corner. Hopefully, with tech companies, nobody dies yet, but you kind of have the same dynamics. Thankfully, I mean, it's not as absolute as in planes, because I think you can totally go on the right of the mean curve. You cannot go on the above the max curve because it's just you don't have the resources. You can totally go on the right of the mean curve. If you go on the right of the mean curve, just means that you cannot catch up with your own growth, and you probably going to have like unhappy users, failing systems, a lot of bad things happening. And much more importantly, you'll be using all of your resources. As soon as you go right of that curve, you'll be using all of your resources to just sustain your company. Which means that you don't have any resources, which is important for innovation. So basically, when you start small and little, you add people and nobody knows what they're doing, and it's fine, it's fun. And so you have a lot of resources, almost all of your resources allocated to innovation and doing new stuff. And as you grow, you have a ton of resources allocated to innovation, because generally your usage or your requirements will be pretty low as you start building your business, and you'll still be hiring people because you start having business, and you'll be able to innovate a lot. And eventually you can end up in that corner. Obviously, as you reorg your organization, you obviously try to push that corner away by moving a little bit those curves, but there's kind of it still exists in some way. I think it's pretty easy for many companies to fall on the right-hand side of the curve. I mean, the big blue well from Twitter is exactly them falling on the right. They were just catching up with their growth, and they were not doing shit on their product, and that's fine because it's not a big problem, but it's interesting that they then don't have any resources for innovation. So hopefully, as a big company, you still have tools to fight against that process, which is basically you may decide as a company that, oh, that thing is really important to us. We're gonna get killed by those guys, or if we don't do anything. And you may decide to say, hey, you, and you stop doing anything that you're doing, and you start working at new things on your own. That way, you kind of kill all of the interface that they have with the external world. They start working on their new project, and they have their own mini spaces to play with, which is pretty great. But the quite interesting property that it gives is that innovation in large, later stage companies is really, when you think about it, reactive. It means that you have to, on purpose, decide to innovate on something, and on purpose decide to product a set of people to bring the innovation resources to be able to work on a new project that is pretty innovative. Whether, as I was saying, I really think that in early stage startups, innovation is systemic, meaning that we generally put too many people in the room, that's fine, and so they'll be innovating because otherwise they go back at home at 2 p.m. Which might be an exaggeration. I mean, we know how startups work. And I think that's kind of the idea that I wanted to share today. Basically, both an example of how Stripe kind of managed to, I think, keep their max curve pretty high for a long time by having that self-organization all the way to hundreds of engineers, which is really interesting. Not necessarily the recipe for that you can use as a solution everywhere, but something interesting to think about. And at the same time, thinking about how, as startups, and I think probably many people are in startups today, we have actually a really great competitive advantage to later stage companies in virtue of having actually a lot of cycles available to innovation. Thank you very much. If you have any question about Stripe or that thing, sorry, feel free to shoot me an email. That's my real email at any time. And thank you.
Any questions?
Yep, there's a question there, no? Come on, any question about SF, whatever, the weather there?
So what kind of solutions have Stripe put in place to get out of this corner coffin?
I think we're still a little bit too young to have necessarily proactively worked against it. Without you kind of not. I mean, you can formalize those things in that way, but you not necessarily formalize it when you are actually living them. You do feel them when you feel like we're not building new products anymore, or not at least not as fast as before, because we have so many asks coming from our users. As an example, Stripe has signed Amazon for some of their business, and those guys, it's awesome. It's awesome to serve Amazon because it's a super large company. You're super happy, and then 3 months down the line, they come back to you and they say, we need this, 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 and that in 6 months, and you're like, oh, okay, if we want to keep them, we're not doing anything else. And so you have to find that trade-off. And I think the way you walk that trade-off is by really, as I was saying, reorganizing yourself, changing the way you organize people, and try to really, from an experimental or an empirical perspective, try to move those curves and free up some resources. And so at Stripe, I think many people say that in fast-growing companies, from something like 500 to 2,000 people, it's like the shittiest time ever. It's like nothing happens. It's all like a big mess because you're too old and too big to operate as a startup. You're still way too young to have built the processes and your culture around being a larger scale company. And so you're really in that kind of a weird teenage ages where you try to do your best, but you're kind of doing it wrong, and that's okay. And so that's the reason why generally to jump across that chasm between 500 and 2,000 people, you really need a lot of resources available, and you need to have a really strong business such that you can waste some of those resources into reorgs to eventually find your way to operate. And at Stripe, more practically, we went through. I think last year we went through 3 to 4 reorgs. I think this year we haven't had one, and in the sense, it's kind of that process that we see happening, I guess.
We've got time for one more. Okay, thank you, Stan.
Thank you.